The terminal was buzzing with the usual noise of an international airport. The sound of rolling suitcases on the polished floor mixed with the calls of boarding announcements echoing from overhead speakers. Families hurried along with children tugging at their parents' hands. Business travelers tapped on laptops while waiting for boarding, and vacationers chatted with excitement about their destinations. Amid this sea of travelers, a tall and imposing man walked quietly, his steps steady, his face calm. His name was Shaq, and although many people recognized him in other places, here he seemed like just another passenger preparing to board his flight. Shaq had chosen to travel in a plain beige t-shirt and simple dark trousers. He carried no signs of wealth, no flashy watch, and no entourage. He preferred it that way. For him, travel was not about showing off, but about moving peacefully from one place to another. Yet his sheer height and broad shoulders made him stand out from the crowd whether he wanted to or not. Some people glanced his way out of curiosity, but he kept his gaze forward, heading toward the line marked clearly with the bold letters, First Class. As he approached, the first-class line was not crowded. A few passengers waited with their boarding passes ready, eager to settle into the comfort of wide leather seats and attentive service. Shaq joined the line naturally, his tall frame rising above the others. Just as he reached the counter, a young flight attendant in a crisp blue uniform stepped forward. She looked at him with a frown, her hand rising as if to block his path. "Excuse me, sir," she said firmly, her tone clipped. "This line is for first-class passengers only." Shaq paused, his dark eyes studying her calmly. "Yes," he replied softly, handing his boarding pass toward her. But the attendant did not even glance at it. Instead, she gave a small shake of her head, her hand still raised like a barrier. "I think you should step aside," she continued. "First class is not for you." The words hung in the air, sharp and dismissive. The passengers nearby turned their heads quickly. Some were shocked, some amused, and some simply curious. Whispers began to spread as if a fire had caught among dry leaves. People wanted to see what would happen next. Shaq lowered his hand slightly, the boarding pass still between his fingers. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he studied the attendant's face, her expression of certainty, her assumption written clearly in her eyes. He had experienced moments like this before, times when people looked at him and made decisions about who he was without knowing a single detail about his life. Yet standing there in the middle of the boarding gate with dozens of eyes fixed on him, it felt heavier than usual. A man in a business suit standing in line smirked and muttered under his breath, "I knew it. He doesn't belong here." His words, though quiet, were not missed by Shaq. A young woman with a child, however, frowned at the scene. She held her little boy's hand tighter as the child looked up with wide eyes, confused about what was happening. "Why is the lady stopping him, Mama?" The boy whispered loudly, his innocent voice carrying further than he intended. The mother hushed him gently, not knowing how to explain prejudice in a way a child could understand. Shaq remained motionless. His heart was steady, his breathing calm, but inside he felt the sting of being dismissed publicly. He knew well enough that true character showed in moments like this. He could have demanded respect, revealed his status, or even called for a supervisor. Instead, he chose silence. Sometimes silence carried more weight than any argument. The attendant grew impatient. She gestured toward the economy line behind them. "Sir, please move to your correct boarding line. We have other first-class passengers waiting." Shaq finally spoke, his voice deep and measured. "I am in the correct line." His tone was not angry, not defensive, but it carried a quiet strength that made the surrounding passengers lean in, waiting for what would follow. Yet before anything more could be said, 2 airport officers began walking toward the gate. Their uniforms were crisp, their movements brisk. It seemed the attendant had signaled for reinforcement. The crowd grew restless. Some passengers pulled out their phones, ready to record the incident, hoping for a moment of drama to share online. Others whispered opinions back and forth, already deciding who was right and who was wrong without having all the facts. Shaq stood still, his posture straight, his eyes calm. He had learned long ago that anger would not change minds blinded by assumptions. The real power was in patience, in waiting for the truth to reveal itself. The little boy who had been watching tugged again at his mother's sleeve. "Mama, why won't they let him go? He's bigger than everyone here. He looks like a superhero." His innocent words, free of prejudice, carried a weight heavier than any adult comment. Shaq heard them and felt a small warmth in his chest. A reminder that children see the world more clearly than grown-ups often do. The flight attendant, still standing firm, looked almost victorious as the officers approached. She folded her arms and glanced back at Shaq with a mixture of authority and impatience. The message in her eyes was clear. You do not belong here, and soon everyone will see it. But Shaq only nodded slightly, his face unreadable. The officers stepped closer, their presence adding tension to the moment. The whispers grew louder, and even the gate agents behind the counter looked uncertain. Some passengers exchanged glances, sensing that the situation was about to shift in an unexpected way. Shaq's hand lowered slowly, his boarding pass still untouched by the attendant. He knew something that no one else in that line knew. Not the attendant, not the officers, not the crowd. It was a truth that would silence the whispers, erase the smirks, and turn judgment into shame. But he chose not to reveal it yet. Timing mattered. The attendant, mistaking his patience for submission, lifted her chin slightly and gestured again. "Step aside, sir. This is not your place." And at that very moment, the atmosphere in the terminal thickened. The story that was about to unfold would be remembered not just as a clash at an airport gate, but as a powerful lesson about humility, respect, and the danger of judging someone by their appearance. Shaq remained where he was, calm and unshaken. The stage was set. The truth was waiting, and the world around him had no idea what was about to be revealed. The air inside the terminal felt heavier the moment Shaq chose not to argue. His tall frame stood like a statue, his deep eyes holding no anger yet carrying a silence that made people more uncomfortable than shouting ever could. In a world where people expected confrontation, his refusal to meet harshness with harshness created a strange, quiet tension. Passengers shuffled in line, craning their necks to watch. Some were secretly entertained, others uneasy, but all were drawn to the calm figure of the man who had just been told he did not belong in first class. Shaq's silence was not weakness. It was the kind of silence that comes from years of understanding how the world often works. He had walked into boardrooms where people assumed he was security, instead of the man signing contracts. He had entered restaurants where the staff led him automatically toward the back, never suspecting he was the owner of the building itself. He had heard dismissive tones, felt doubting eyes, and endured moments where people measured his worth only by what they saw on the surface. Each time he had carried himself with the same steady calm. This moment at the gate was no different, yet the sting of it still cut deep because of its public weight. The whispers of the crowd rose like small waves hitting the shore. "Maybe he tried to sneak into first class," one woman said quietly to her companion. A man in a blazer leaned closer to another passenger and muttered, "Happens all the time. People think they can upgrade themselves." The flight attendant straightened her uniform with a little more confidence, as if the support of strangers justified her choice. Her eyes no longer wavered. She believed she had done the right thing. Shaq lowered his head slightly, not out of shame but as though he was listening to something deeper within himself. His silence made people restless. Humans often misunderstand stillness, thinking it means defeat. But in Shaq's heart, the stillness was strength. He knew he could speak a single sentence that would end the debate, flash a card that would silence every whisper, or simply make a call that would change the course of the flight. Yet he held back. He wanted something bigger than victory. He wanted the moment itself to teach those watching. The officers finally reached the gate. Their polished shoes clicked against the tiled floor as they approached, their faces professional but uncertain. They had been called to enforce order, yet the man before them radiated dignity, not disruption. The taller officer glanced at the attendant, silently asking for confirmation. She gave a small nod, her lips pressed tightly together, convinced she was protecting the prestige of her airline. The crowd leaned in. A few people discreetly raised their phones, pretending to check messages, but aiming their cameras toward the scene. This was the age of instant judgment, where a stranger's humiliation could be recorded and shared with the tap of a screen. Shaq noticed but did not flinch. His silence grew heavier, spreading across the gate like an invisible force. Even the child from earlier, still holding his mother's hand, felt it. He looked at Shaq with wide eyes, whispering again, "Mama, he doesn't look wrong to me. He looks kind." The mother squeezed her son's hand tighter. Her heart conflicted between fear of speaking up and the pull of justice. The business traveler in the suit smirked again, clearly enjoying the scene. "This is what happens when people think money buys them everything," he said a little louder this time, hoping Shaq would hear. The words slid into the air like poison, but Shaq did not react. Instead, he kept his eyes calm, his breathing even, his body steady. His silence was more powerful than any argument the man could throw. The officers finally stood in front of him. One of them cleared his throat and said politely, "Sir, may we see your boarding pass?" It was the first official request made directly to Shaq. He extended his large hand, the small slip of paper balanced between his fingers. The officer took it carefully, his eyes scanning the printed details. Within seconds, his brow furrowed. His gaze flicked from the ticket to Shaq, then to the attendant, then back again. The silence deepened and the tension thickened. For the first time, doubt crossed the attendant's face. She had not expected hesitation from the officer. She leaned slightly forward, her voice quieter but still sharp. "He was trying to board first class without authorization. I stopped him." The officer said nothing, still holding the ticket, still staring at the name printed boldly across the top. A name not just recognized in sports or business, but a name tied directly to the very airline logo behind the counter. The officer's partner stepped closer, whispering something quickly into his ear. Recognition dawned. Their professional composure wavered for a fraction of a second before tightening again. They exchanged a glance, one that carried both surprise and a silent agreement. This was not the confrontation they expected. The crowd sensed the shift, though they did not know why. The business traveler who had been smirking fell quiet, his smugness dimming as uncertainty replaced it. Shaq remained silent. He had given them the truth without uttering a word. His ticket held the power to expose assumptions and turn judgment into shame. Still, he did not boast, did not declare ownership, did not humiliate the attendant who had dismissed him. His silence itself was teaching the lesson. It forced everyone to confront their own thoughts, their own biases, their own quickness to decide who belonged and who did not. The little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve once more. "Mama, why aren't they letting him go yet?" The mother's eyes softened, her voice breaking slightly as she whispered back, "Sometimes people see only what they want to see, son, but the truth always finds a way." Her words carried further than she intended, reaching the ears of others who now shifted uncomfortably. The officer handed back the boarding pass, his tone respectful now. "Everything checks out, sir." That was all he said, but those simple words struck the crowd like a bell. Gasps rippled quietly. The attendant's face flushed, her eyes darting down in sudden realization that she had been wrong. Yet Shaq remained steady, his silence still unbroken. In that silence, the entire terminal learned something. They learned that patience can be more powerful than anger. They learned that silence can hold more dignity than shouting. They learned that assumptions crumble when truth stands quietly in their path. And above all, they learned that the measure of a person is never in the surface of appearance, but in the depth of their character when tested in the public eye. Shaq finally stepped forward, his stride unhurried, his presence still towering but never boastful. Each step was a quiet reminder that respect cannot be demanded through anger. It must be earned through grace. And as he moved past the gate, the boy smiled at him once more, his small hand waving in admiration. For the child, Shaq was no longer just a passenger. He was living proof that dignity needs no loud defense, only the courage to remain calm when the world tries to deny your place. The whispers faded into silence. The phones lowered slowly, and the attendant, still standing at the gate, realized the weight of her mistake. But the real lesson was not hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had watched and judged and whispered in that brief, unforgettable moment of silence. The atmosphere in the terminal was no longer ordinary. What had started as a routine boarding process had transformed into a tense moment where everyone seemed to forget about their own flights and instead focused on the tall man who stood silently at the gate. The attendant's sharp words still echoed in the air, and people could not stop whispering about them. Every conversation became a small judgment, and every judgment added fuel to the fire that surrounded Shaq. Passengers who had been quietly scrolling through their phones were now leaning closer to hear the exchange. Some had already drawn their own conclusions before even seeing the boarding pass. "He probably tried to sneak up here," one man muttered, his voice low but filled with certainty. Another person nodded and replied, "Yes, first class is expensive. Not everyone can afford it." Their words were not directed at Shaq, but they cut into the air as if they were knives. The woman standing with her child could not ignore what was happening. She looked around at the faces of strangers, seeing how quickly people judged without knowing anything. Her son tugged at her sleeve again, his innocent eyes wide and curious. "Mama," he whispered, "why do they think he is wrong? He was standing in the line like everyone else." She hesitated, not knowing how to explain to a child that people often judge what they do not understand. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people make decisions too fast, without thinking about kindness." The boy frowned and looked at Shaq. To him, the man did not look like someone trying to cheat or cause trouble. He looked strong, calm, and gentle at the same time. In his young heart, he could not understand why someone so kind-looking was being treated as if he was in the wrong place. So he did the only thing his heart told him to do. He smiled at Shaq. It was a small smile, but in that moment it carried more weight than all the whispers combined. Shaq noticed. His lips curled into the faintest smile in return, a silent acknowledgement of the boy's pure-hearted gesture. It reminded him of something he always believed. Children see truth more clearly than adults clouded by pride or prejudice. That single smile became his anchor in the storm of whispers, a reminder that not all eyes looked at him with suspicion. Some saw him for who he was, not who they assumed him to be, but the whispers did not stop. The business traveler in the expensive suit, who had been smirking since the beginning, decided to make his opinion louder. "This is exactly why they should check tickets before letting anyone near this line," he declared, loud enough for those around to hear. "People like him think they can just walk into privilege." Several heads turned toward him, some nodding, others frowning, but no one directly challenged him. Shaq did not react, though the sting of the words pressed into him. His silence was his shield. The flight attendant stood a little taller, her confidence strengthened by the crowd's whispers. To her, each judgment from the passengers was proof that she had made the right decision. She folded her arms and glanced at Shaq with a look that carried both impatience and victory. In her mind, she had prevented a mistake, protected the standards of her airline, and done her duty. She did not realize that the truth waiting to reveal itself would turn her certainty into regret. More passengers joined in with quiet comments. Some pitied Shaq, saying it was embarrassing to be stopped in front of everyone. Others defended the attendant, saying she was only doing her job. The air was thick with assumptions, each one shaping the moment into a spectacle. Yet in the middle of it all, Shaq remained calm, like a mountain that does not move even when winds howl around it. The officers, still holding his boarding pass, exchanged glances again. They knew the truth that the crowd did not. They recognized the name printed boldly across the pass. They realized the magnitude of the situation, but they hesitated to reveal it just yet. The tension in their hesitation only fueled the curiosity of those watching. People wanted answers, and they wanted them now. The boy pulled at his mother's sleeve once more. His young voice rose with an innocent boldness. "Mama, if he has the ticket, why don't they let him go?" His question was not whispered this time. It was spoken loud enough for people around them to hear. Heads turned toward the child, and some shifted uncomfortably. The mother blushed, embarrassed by the attention, but she did not scold him. She squeezed his hand and said quietly, "Sometimes people are too slow to see what is right in front of them." Shaq's eyes met the boy's again. This time he gave a slow nod as if to silently tell him, "Patience, little one. The truth always comes." That moment between them felt almost sacred, a bond of unspoken understanding between innocence and experience. The whispers began to shift. Where there had been certainty, there was now doubt. Some passengers who had been quick to judge now softened their voices, realizing perhaps they had spoken too soon. Others remained stubborn, holding on to their assumptions as if letting go would mean admitting fault. The business traveler in the suit grew restless, his smirk fading into irritation. He muttered again, "Ridiculous. They should just remove him and move on." But his words no longer carried the same weight. The crowd was changing. The flight attendant, however, still stood her ground. She looked at the officers, waiting for them to act. She believed she had done her duty and expected them to support her decision. Yet when they returned the boarding pass to Shaq with a tone of respect, the color drained from her face. Her certainty began to crumble. For the first time, she glanced nervously at the crowd, realizing how many eyes were watching her, how many whispers would soon turn against her. The boy's smile grew wider as Shaq received his pass back. In his young heart, justice had been restored. He clapped his hands once, the sound soft but powerful in its purity. People turned to look at him, and in that small clap, many saw the truth more clearly than in any argument. A child had seen what adults had missed. Dignity cannot be taken away by words, and respect cannot be denied when the truth is undeniable. Shaq stepped forward at last, his silence still unbroken. The whispers followed him, but now they were different. Some were filled with shame, others with admiration, but all carried the weight of realization. The moment had changed, and everyone in the terminal knew they had witnessed something more than a boarding delay. They had witnessed a lesson about humility, patience, and the danger of judging too quickly. And as Shaq moved past the gate, the whispers lingered, echoing like ripples on water. Each person carried them differently. For some, they were a reminder of their own quickness to judge. For others, they were a spark to think more carefully before speaking. But for the boy, they became a story he would carry forever. The day he saw a man stand strong in silence while the world learned to see with new eyes. The sound of polished shoes striking the floor drew everyone's attention as the two airport officers approached the gate. Their presence was like a wave pushing through the restless crowd, and conversations that had grown loud a moment earlier dropped into murmurs. People instinctively stepped back, creating space for the officers to reach the tall man who stood silently, still holding his composure despite the storm that surrounded him. The flight attendant straightened, her shoulders squared with the kind of confidence that comes from believing the system will always support her judgment. She gestured subtly toward Shaq, her eyes filled with expectation that the officers would remove him swiftly and restore order. Shaq did not move. His tall frame stood steady, his calm eyes watching the officers without a trace of fear or nervousness. He had faced bigger crowds, louder critics, and harder battles than this, yet he also knew the sting of being doubted and the heaviness of being misjudged without anyone bothering to ask for the truth. He remained still because sometimes strength does not come from force but from patience. The officer stopped in front of him. One, slightly older with sharp lines on his face, held out a hand. "Sir, may we see your boarding pass?" His voice was polite but firm, carrying the authority of someone trained to maintain order while avoiding escalation. Shaq extended his hand, the ticket balanced effortlessly in his large fingers. The officer took it, and for a moment the world seemed to pause as his eyes scanned the details. Whispers erupted again in the crowd. "They're going to escort him out. I knew he didn't belong here. Why didn't he just go to his seat in economy?" Others whispered with sympathy, shaking their heads and murmuring, "Poor man, he must be so embarrassed." Every whisper carried its own weight, pressing down like layers of judgment. The flight attendant felt those whispers as applause for her actions. Her chin tilted upward with a quiet pride, her lips tight as though she had successfully defended the integrity of her airline. But then, the officer's eyes froze on the name printed on the boarding pass. His brows furrowed slightly, his lips parting as if he wanted to say something but held back. He looked up at Shaq, then down at the ticket again. His partner leaned closer, reading the name as well, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. Both officers exchanged a quick glance that did not go unnoticed. Something shifted in their demeanor, a subtle change that even the crowd could sense, though they did not yet understand. The business traveler in the expensive suit, still standing nearby with a smug expression, chuckled under his breath. "Now they'll see," he muttered. "You can't just waltz into first class." His words were meant for the people around him, but they carried far enough for Shaq to hear. Still, Shaq did not reply. He knew the truth resting in the officer's hands was louder than any insult thrown his way. The officer handed the ticket back with surprising gentleness. His tone was different now, more respectful. "Everything checks out, sir." That single sentence created a ripple through the terminal. The whispers turned into gasps and the smug smiles faded. People who had been so certain only moments ago now looked at one another with doubt and confusion. The flight attendant's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came. She felt the eyes of the crowd shift toward her. The authority she believed was hers slipped away in silence. For a second, she considered doubling down, insisting on her judgment. But the officer's respectful demeanor toward Shaq shattered her certainty. Her throat tightened with a mix of embarrassment and fear. She had not just made a mistake. She had made it publicly, in front of dozens of witnesses who would remember every word she had spoken. Shaq did not smirk, did not gloat, did not raise his voice to humiliate her. Instead, he slipped the boarding pass back into his pocket with calm precision. His eyes remained steady, neither cold nor forgiving, just deep with the weight of a man who had seen this story play out far too many times. He knew the damage was already done, not to him but to those who had chosen judgment before truth. The little boy's voice broke through the heavy silence. "Mama, they said everything is okay." His words were full of relief, his small face glowing with pride as if he had personally defended Shaq. The mother squeezed his hand and nodded softly, her heart stirred by the dignity she had just witnessed. The boy beamed at Shaq, his eyes shining with admiration. That innocent connection, untainted by prejudice, was worth more to Shaq than the silence of the crowd. The business traveler, once so confident in his mocking, looked away awkwardly, pretending to scroll through his phone. His smirk had vanished, replaced by discomfort. He realized that he too had been exposed, not by confrontation, but by truth quietly standing in front of him. Around him, other passengers shifted uneasily, replaying their whispers in their minds and feeling the sting of shame. The flight attendant finally found her voice, but it was shaky. I was only trying to protect the integrity of the cabin," she muttered, her words barely audible. It was not an apology, not fully, but it was the closest she could come in that moment. She could not meet Shaq's eyes, not because he glared at her, but because his calm dignity made her own actions feel heavier than any scolding could have. Shaq gave a small nod, not of approval or forgiveness, but as if to say he understood enough. He stepped forward slowly, his tall frame moving with quiet authority. Every step he took toward the boarding gate carried weight, and the passengers parted for him instinctively. It was not fear that made them step aside, but respect born from realizing they had judged wrongly. As he walked, the officers remained still, their respectful silence a shield around him. The flight attendant lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning, her once proud stance collapsing into humility. The crowd, though hushed, could not stop watching. They had expected drama, shouting, maybe even an arrest. Instead, they had witnessed something far more powerful: grace in the face of disrespect, patience in the face of judgment, and dignity in the face of humiliation. Shaq's silence was no longer just silence. It had become a mirror, reflecting back the flaws of everyone who had doubted him, whispered about him, or dismissed him without giving him the chance to be seen for who he truly was. And in that mirror, people saw themselves more clearly than they wanted to. The little boy clapped softly just once, his small hands breaking the silence with an innocent sound that carried more weight than the murmurs of adults. A few people smiled weakly, ashamed yet moved by the child's honesty. The mother looked at Shaq with eyes that silently thanked him for teaching her son a lesson no classroom could provide. As Shaq handed his boarding pass to the final agent and walked onto the jet bridge, the whispers behind him began to shift. They were no longer filled with judgment or mockery, but with awe and reflection. People spoke quietly about what they had just witnessed, some embarrassed, some inspired, but none unchanged. The flight attendant remained frozen at the gate, her mind racing. She had enforced her authority, but had forgotten humility. She had judged a man without knowing his truth, and in doing so, she had exposed her own weakness to the world. She would carry that moment for a long time, not as shame alone, but as a lesson she could never ignore again. And in the stillness left behind, the crowd realized they had not just seen a passenger board his flight. They had seen a lesson unfold before their eyes, a lesson about respect, about the danger of assumptions, and about the quiet power of dignity when authority arrives and truth stands unshaken. The crowd inside the terminal had shifted from restless chatter to uneasy silence. People who had once leaned forward with excitement now leaned back with shame, avoiding each other's eyes as if their own whispers still echoed in the air. The two officers who had first approached Shaq now stood taller, their composure carefully controlled, but their eyes carried respect they had not shown before. The flight attendant's face burned crimson, her throat tight with the weight of realization. She had been so certain only moments ago, so quick to judge, but the truth had slipped from her hands the moment the officer returned the boarding pass with a quiet reverence. Shaq remained calm. He did not gloat, he did not scold. He did not raise his voice to make the crowd feel smaller. He simply held his boarding pass, his large hand steady, his eyes calm as a deep lake untouched by the storm raging above it. To the crowd, he was a man who had endured humiliation without losing his dignity. To the officers, he was someone who had met their authority without a flicker of fear. To the flight attendant, he was the proof that her judgment had been flawed from the start. And to the boy still holding his mother's hand, he was the very picture of strength. It would have been easy for Shaq to step forward, hand his ticket to the gate agent, and disappear into the plane, leaving the crowd with nothing more than the faint sting of guilt. But there are moments in life when silence, though powerful, is not enough. Moments when truth must rise, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. Shaq decided this was one of those moments. He turned slightly, his deep voice steady as it rolled across the terminal. "You told me I did not belong here," he said softly, his words aimed at the attendant but loud enough for all to hear. There was no anger in his tone, no desire to wound. It was simply truth spoken aloud. The attendant's lips trembled, her eyes darting away, but she could not answer. Shaq lifted the boarding pass between his fingers, the paper small and fragile compared to the size of his hand. "But this pass says otherwise," he continued. He held it up for a moment, letting the crowd see that it was no ordinary slip of paper. Printed boldly across the top was his name, a name tied not only to fame but to ownership. His voice deepened slightly as he added, "I am not only a first-class passenger, I am the owner of this airline." The revelation struck the terminal like a sudden clap of thunder. Gasps filled the air, conversations broke into stunned fragments, and the crowd shifted on its feet as though the very ground had tilted beneath them. The business traveler who had mocked him earlier froze, his smirk evaporating into pale silence. The woman with the child pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes wide with shock. Even the officers, though already aware, stood straighter as if his words confirmed something sacred. The flight attendant's knees nearly buckled. Her mind raced through every word she had spoken, every gesture she had made, every judgment she had so confidently declared. Each memory burned hotter than the last until her body trembled under the weight of regret. She had dismissed not just a passenger, but the very man whose vision and investment made her job possible. Her voice cracked as she whispered, I did not know." Shaq's eyes softened, but his tone remained steady. "That is the point," he said. "You did not know. You judged without asking, without looking beyond what stood in front of you. Respect should never depend on assumptions. It should be given freely." His words did not strike like arrows. They fell like heavy rain, soaking into the hearts of those who heard them. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, some bowing their heads, others exchanging guilty glances. The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve again, whispering with pride, "Mama, I knew he belonged." The mother nodded with tears in her eyes, her voice breaking as she whispered back, "Yes, you were right." Shaq lowered the boarding pass, sliding it back into his pocket with care. He did not flaunt it, did not wave it as a symbol of victory. He simply let the truth rest where it belonged. No louder than necessary, no sharper than it needed to be. His revelation was not for revenge, but for reflection. The business traveler who had been so loud earlier shifted nervously, his face flushed. He muttered to no one in particular, "Well, anyone could have made that mistake." But his voice carried no weight. No one supported him now. The very people who had nodded along before now looked away from him, ashamed that they had shared in his judgment. He shrank back into the crowd, invisible in the face of truth. The flight attendant's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to apologize, to fall at his feet and beg forgiveness, but words caught in her throat. She had built her confidence on certainty, but certainty had betrayed her. Now she stood exposed, her authority crumbled by the very man she had dismissed. Yet Shaq's calm gaze did not condemn her. He left her with something far heavier than scolding. He left her with the weight of her own conscience. The silence after his revelation was unlike the silence before it. Earlier, the silence had been filled with judgment and whispers. Now it was filled with reflection and regret. Each passenger carried their own thoughts, replaying the moment and realizing how quickly they had chosen sides without evidence. They understood now that they had not just witnessed a man being wronged. They had participated in it through their assumptions and their silence. Shaq finally turned toward the gate agent, his stride unhurried, his presence filling the space without effort. He handed over his boarding pass, and the agent, her hands trembling slightly, scanned it with the utmost care. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and she gave the smallest nod of respect before returning it. There was no announcement, no applause, no cheer, yet the moment carried the weight of a lesson that every person would take with them long after the flight had ended. As Shaq walked down the jet bridge, the boy broke into a grin and clapped his hands again. The sound was small, but it carried more purity than all the noise that had filled the terminal earlier. A few passengers smiled faintly, their shame mixing with admiration. The mother wiped at her eyes, whispering a quiet thank you to no one in particular. The attendant stood frozen, her hands shaking, her heart pounding in her chest. She would carry the memory of this moment for years. Not as a wound inflicted on her, but as a turning point, a moment when she learned that authority without humility is fragile, and judgment without truth is dangerous. For the crowd, the revelation was more than a story to tell. It was a mirror held up to their own hearts, forcing them to confront how easily they had joined in assumptions and whispers. Some would forget by the time they boarded their flights, but others would carry it with them as a quiet reminder that respect costs nothing. Yet it changes everything, and for Shaq, the revelation was not about proving ownership. It was about showing once again that true power does not come from money or position. It comes from dignity, from patience, from the ability to stand in silence until the truth reveals itself, and then to speak it with calm strength. He disappeared down the jet bridge, but his presence lingered behind, etched into the hearts of every person who had witnessed the moment. The revelation had transformed a simple boarding line into a lesson that none of them would forget. The energy inside the terminal shifted once more as Shaq's revelation began to sink in. For the passengers, the words he had spoken were still ringing in their ears. Not only was he a first-class passenger, he was the owner of the very airline whose logo gleamed above the gate. The weight of that truth pressed heavily on everyone, but it pressed heaviest on the flight attendant who had been so certain in her judgment. Her confidence had evaporated, her authority shattered not by anger, not by punishment, but by truth wrapped in dignity. She stood there trembling, replaying every sharp word she had said, realizing how small they sounded against the enormity of what she had just learned. Shaq, however, did not stand there savoring her discomfort. He had no interest in humiliation or revenge. Instead, he carried himself with the same calm grace that had defined him from the beginning. He walked toward the boarding gate with measured steps, and though dozens of eyes followed him, he did not look back to bask in their regret. He looked ahead, his stride slow but purposeful, as if teaching everyone by example that strength is not about proving someone wrong, but about showing how to be right without cruelty. The child's soft clap still lingered in the air, and Shaq caught sight of him again. Their eyes met, and Shaq gave the boy a subtle nod, one that carried gratitude. It was a silent thank you for the innocence that had cut through all the noise, a reminder that truth is often clearest in the heart of a child. The boy smiled so widely that his mother felt tears welling in her eyes. She whispered to him, "Do you see what respect looks like?" The boy nodded, not fully understanding the depth of the moment but feeling its power all the same. Passengers who had whispered earlier now found themselves uncomfortably quiet. Many shifted on their feet, some pulling at their collars, others pretending to check their phones, all hoping no one remembered the things they had said only minutes before. But their silence was not meaningless. It was the silence of people reflecting, people realizing that they too had been part of the judgment. Some felt shame, some felt admiration, but all felt changed. The flight attendant's hands gripped the podium as if it were the only thing holding her up. Her breath came shallow, her cheeks flushed with heat. She wanted to apologize, but her throat locked. What words could possibly erase the sting of her dismissal? What excuse could carry weight against the truth of who she had spoken to? She looked at Shaq, her lips trembling, but his calm eyes did not demand her apology. They left her to wrestle with her own conscience, and that was far heavier than anger could ever have been. Shaq paused near the jet bridge for a brief moment, turning slightly back toward the crowd. His deep voice carried with steady clarity, not raised but strong enough for all to hear. "Respect should never be given because of a name, a title, or a position," he said. "Respect should be given because every person deserves it." His words fell over the crowd like a soft rain after a storm, soaking into hearts that had been hardened by judgment only moments earlier. The business traveler in the suit shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. He remembered every smug remark he had made, every nod he had given to the attendant's actions. Now he stood silent, wishing he could disappear into the floor. He realized that in his eagerness to feel superior, he had revealed more about his own character than about the man he had mocked. Others in the crowd felt the same. They carried the weight of their whispers like stones in their pockets. each one a reminder of how quickly assumptions can lead to shame. The officers who had once approached Shaq with authority now watched him with admiration. They had seen many confrontations in their careers, but never one like this. They saw a man who had faced humiliation with dignity, who had revealed truth not with anger but with calm patience. They stood straighter, their respect for him etched into their expressions. Shaq finally turned and walked down the jet bridge, his presence leaving the crowd heavier, yet wiser. As his tall figure disappeared from sight, people exhaled breaths they did not realize they had been holding. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with lessons, heavy with reflection. The boy pulled at his mother's sleeve once more. "Mama," he whispered. He was kind even when they were not kind to him. His mother knelt and looked into his eyes, her voice tender. "Yes, my son. That is real strength. Never forget it." The boy nodded seriously, the lesson carving itself into his young heart like a mark that would never fade. The flight attendant's tears finally spilled over. She covered her face for a moment, overwhelmed by the realization that she had judged the very man who had the power to define her career. But deeper than that was the sting of realizing she had failed to offer respect to a fellow human being, regardless of his status. She whispered to herself, "I should have treated him better, even if he had not been the owner." That truth struck her harder than any reprimand could have. Some passengers tried to comfort her with small gestures, a hand on her shoulder, a sympathetic nod, but she barely noticed. She was lost in thought, trapped in the weight of what she had learned. She knew she would carry this lesson forever, not as shame alone but as a turning point. Every passenger she greeted from that day forward, she vowed, would be met with respect no matter how they looked or dressed. Inside the jet bridge, Shaq walked slowly, his mind calm. He was not angry. He was not hurt. He was thoughtful. He knew this moment was not just about him. It was about every person who had ever been told they did not belong, every person dismissed without being seen for who they truly were. He carried them with him as he boarded the plane, sitting quietly in his first-class seat, not as a man flaunting his position, but as a man who had just taught a lesson without raising his voice. The plane filled slowly with passengers, each one a little quieter than usual. They avoided eye contact with him, yet they could not stop glancing his way. Some felt guilt, others admiration, but all felt the pull of respect. The child waved at him once more as he passed, and Shaq gave him a gentle nod that lit up the boy's face with pride. By the time the last passenger boarded, the story had already spread beyond the terminal. Whispers turned into retellings, and retellings turned into lessons shared across phones and conversations. What had begun as a small confrontation at the gate became something larger, a story about judgment, patience, and humility. And for those who had been there, it was more than just a story. It was a moment etched into their lives, a moment when they saw dignity outshine prejudice, when they saw humility teach more than authority ever could. Shaq leaned back in his seat, his face calm, his heart steady. He had not sought to embarrass anyone, but he had not hidden the truth either. He had chosen a path that was neither harsh nor weak. He had chosen grace, and in doing so, he had left behind a lesson that would ripple through the lives of everyone who had witnessed it. It was not just a boarding. It was a moment of transformation, a lesson in humility, and one that would be remembered long after the flight itself was forgotten. When the doors of the plane finally closed and the cabin lights dimmed, the passengers carried with them more than luggage and boarding passes. They carried the weight of what they had just witnessed at the gate. The murmurs that had filled the terminal were now hushed into thoughtful silence as each person replayed the moment in their own mind. Some stared out of the windows, watching the ground crew prepare for departure, but their thoughts were far from the runway. Others leaned back against their seats, eyes closed, but sleep did not come easily because the memory of Shaq's words lingered. For Shaq, the flight was no different than any other. He sat quietly in his seat, his large frame making the wide chair seem smaller than it was. He adjusted the seatbelt, glanced briefly at the safety card in front of him, and closed his eyes. To any passerby, he looked like a tired man settling into a long journey, but inside his heart there was peace. He had faced yet another moment of judgment, another test of patience, and had walked away not with bitterness but with dignity and tact. He did not think of revenge, nor did he dwell on embarrassment. Instead, he thought of the little boy who had smiled at him when no one else did. That simple, innocent gesture carried more value than all the whispers combined. As the plane lifted off the ground, cutting through clouds and climbing toward the sky, the story of the gate had already begun its journey far beyond the cabin. Several passengers had recorded parts of it on their phones. They shared it with friends, family, and soon strangers on social platforms. Each person who retold it framed it in their own way, some as a tale of prejudice overcome, others as a lesson in respect, and others still as an example of how dignity can silence a crowd. Within hours, the story spread across thousands of screens, and with each retelling, more people found inspiration. But the true impact was not in the clicks or the comments. It was in the quiet reflections of those who had been there in person. The business traveler in the suit, who had once smirked with certainty, sat several rows back, staring down at his folded hands. He thought about his own life, the many times he had judged others before giving them a chance, the times he had dismissed someone based on clothing, accent, or appearance. For the first time, he felt the sting of seeing himself from the outside, realizing how ugly arrogance looked when compared to grace. He promised himself silently that he would change, that he would look at people differently from that day forward. The mother and her boy sat further back, and she brushed her fingers through his hair as he leaned sleepily against her shoulder. She whispered softly, "Remember this day, my love. Remember how he stayed calm, how he never raised his voice, how he showed respect even when he was not given any. That is what makes a man great." The boy, half asleep, mumbled, "I will remember, Mama." She kissed his forehead, knowing the lesson would stay with him far longer than the flight itself. The flight attendant moved slowly through the aisle, her smile shaky, her movements careful. She poured water for passengers, adjusted luggage in overhead bins, and checked seatbelts. But her mind was far away from her tasks. She kept replaying the moment at the gate, each word she had spoken replaying louder in her memory than the hum of the engines. She had judged him, dismissed him, embarrassed him, and yet he had responded not with anger but with patience. That patience was what burned most deeply in her chest, because it forced her to confront her own actions. She wanted to approach him, to apologize. But every time she neared his row, her courage failed. Her throat tightened, her palms sweated, and her heart pounded. She looked at him once, saw him resting quietly with his eyes closed, and she realized that any apology would matter less than the lesson itself. She promised herself then and there that she would never again judge someone by their appearance. She would treat every passenger, whether in first class or economy, with the same respect. That vow became her silent apology, one she carried into every shift from that day forward. Hours later, when the plane landed and passengers filed out one by one, many stole glances at Shaq as they passed. Some nodded respectfully, some gave small smiles, and others simply lowered their eyes, humbled by the weight of their earlier assumptions. Shaq returned their gestures with calm kindness, never boasting, never reminding them of what had happened. For him, the moment had already passed. The lesson had been taught, and that was enough. Outside the airport, the story continued to ripple. Those who had been there told it to others, who told it again, until it became more than an incident. It became a parable, a modern reminder that respect should never be conditional. In coffee shops, offices, schools, and homes, people repeated the tale, how a man had been told he did not belong, how he revealed himself as the owner, and how he chose humility instead of humiliation. Each retelling carried the heart of the story further, touching people who had never set foot in that airport. And for Shaq, the story was not about proving ownership or demanding recognition. It was about something deeper. It was about showing the world, one moment at a time, that dignity does not need to shout, that patience speaks louder than anger, that respect, given freely, has the power to change hearts. He never needed the world to know his title. What mattered was that the world learned the lesson. The little boy, years later, would remember that day more clearly than many other childhood memories. He would tell the story to his friends in school, then to his colleagues when he grew older, and one day to his own children. He would speak of the tall man who stood silently while the world judged him, the man who revealed truth not with pride but with calm, the man who showed that greatness is not measured by wealth, but by character. And every time he told it, the boy-turned-man would smile, because he had seen the truth with his own eyes. The flight attendant, too, carried the memory throughout her career. Each time she greeted a passenger, She remembered the weight of her mistake and the grace with which it was met. That day became the cornerstone of her professionalism, shaping her into not just a better attendant but a better person. She learned humility in the hardest way, but it stayed with her as a guiding light. The businessman in the suit changed as well. The shame he had felt became a seed for growth. He began to notice how often he dismissed people before giving them a chance, and slowly he changed his ways. He learned to listen more, to respect more, and to judge less. The memory of that gate and of the man who had stood so calmly became his silent mentor in moments of pride, and the passengers, scattered across cities and countries, carried their own pieces of the lesson into their lives. Some shared the story at dinner tables, others in classrooms, others still in quiet conversations with friends. It became one of those rare experiences that traveled far beyond its origin, reshaping lives quietly, humbly, like ripples expanding across water. Shaq, for his part, never boasted about the incident. He never told it as a story of triumph. To him, it was just another moment when life reminded him of the importance of patience, respect, and humility. But he knew the impact was greater than himself. He knew that sometimes a lesson is not taught with grand speeches, but with silence, dignity, and a truth revealed at the right moment. The lasting impact of that day was not the revelation of ownership. It was not the embarrassment of an attendant or the shame of a crowd. The lasting impact was the lesson that lived in the hearts of those who witnessed it and those who heard it later. That we should never be too quick to judge, that every person deserves respect, and that true strength lies not in proving power but in showing grace.